Hi, my YouTube family. I'm the Crime Whisper, and tonight, I'm here to help you unwind. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and that's perfectly okay. So before we begin, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where are you watching from. And what time is it for you right now? Now, get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, and let's begin tonight's case. Case 1. Daniel Whitmore. The ghost of Essex. It was the autumn of 2013, tucked away in the industrial sprawl of Essex. A man named Daniel Whitmore was orchestrating one of the most sophisticated human smuggling operations in UK history. Whitmore wasn't like the loud, reckless traffickers who made headlines. He was deliberate, calculated, a former maritime logistics expert with years of experience in international shipping. He used that knowledge to build a smuggling network that stretched from Southeast Asia to Eastern Europe. He worked with corrupt officials in port cities and exploited every loophole in the customs system. His face was never seen, his name never signed. He was a ghost moving in shadows, hiding behind layers of fake companies and clean shipping records. Whitmore's method: cold, quiet, and devastating. He favored refrigerated shipping containers. Their sensitive cargo meant fewer inspections. Inside these sealed boxes, hidden behind textiles, machinery, and food, were people hundreds, maybe thousands risked everything for a new life. Some made it. Many didn't. October 2013, his boldest plan yet. In early October, Whitmore set up his biggest shipment yet. 50 people from Vietnam, each paying upwards of £30,000, hoping to reach the UK. Their journey spanned weeks through the jungles of Southeast Asia, into Eastern Europe, and finally to a warehouse on the outskirts of Zeebrugge, Belgium. The warehouse was silent, abandoned. Rusted containers towered in the dark, remnants of a time when this place still pulsed with trade. Under a flickering overhead light, the group of migrants, young men, a few women, even 2 teenagers, stood huddled together, exhausted, frightened, hopeful. One of them, Min, a former schoolteacher, gripped a photo of his wife and newborn son back in Vietnam. He had promised to return home with money to build them a better life. But, as he stared into the dark, frozen metal box they were about to enter, panic began to set in. He had heard stories, the ones who didn't survive, the ones who suffocated in silence. But there was no time to think, no time to second guess. The smugglers were rushing. One by one, the passengers were loaded into the lorry, their bags thrown in after them, the doors sealed shut, and with it, the light and the air vanished. Inside the container, darkness, the scent of sweat, fear, and steel. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else promised, "By sunrise, we'll be free." The driver, the man behind the wheel, was Mark Davies, a British driver with a long trail of minor offenses: tax evasion, petty smuggling, theft. Perfect for Whitmore's operation. Skilled, desperate, and most importantly, kept in the dark. Whitmore never told his drivers the full story. They knew just enough to get through checkpoints, nothing more. The less they knew, the harder it would be to talk if they got caught. Mark lit a cigarette as he climbed into the cab of the truck. The paperwork said frozen meat. Everything looked legit. As the truck pulled out of the warehouse and rolled onto the open highway, Whitmore was already gone. He never stayed to watch. There were more shipments to plan, more money to launder. He had built his empire on human desperation, and business was booming. A fatal miscalculation, but this time, something was off. A small error, a deviation in routine, and it would prove fatal. The refrigerated truck rumbled through the French countryside, its tires whispering over wet asphalt. Inside, the 50 passengers sat in silence. Bodies packed tight. Condensation clung to the metal walls. The air was thick, heavy, and growing thinner with every passing hour. Min sat pressed against the side, knees drawn to his chest. He tried to stay calm, thought of his wife, his child. Just a few more hours, he told himself. Then this nightmare would be over. Meanwhile, Mark kept driving. The Channel Tunnel was the next checkpoint. He had done it before. Smile, flash the paperwork, say it's frozen meat. Keep it casual. At the tunnel, everything went as expected. The customs officer barely looked at the forms. Another truck, another day. Mark exhaled and drove the lorry onto the Eurotunnel train. The vehicle rocked slightly as it settled onto the platform. He didn't know it yet, but inside that sealed container, the oxygen was already running low. Case 1. Daniel Whitmore, the ghost of Essex. The tunnel carried them forward toward the United Kingdom. But inside the sealed container, something was going terribly wrong. What began as mild discomfort was now full-blown distress. The temperature had dropped. The air was thinning. Min could feel it tightening in his chest, each breath a struggle. Someone banged against the metal wall. 3 sharp knocks. A signal. Silence. Another person tried, this time pounding harder. Still nothing. Near the front, a woman began to cry softly. The realization began to sink in, heavy and cold. Something was wrong. Min clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. Panic would only burn through what little oxygen they had left. He thought of his wife, his newborn son, the promise he made to return. But as more time passed, the air became stale, thick with breath and fear. The first to collapse was a boy, barely 16. His older brother shook him, whispering his name, but the boy didn't respond. Then another, and another. The sound of shallow breathing faded into the heavy silence of death. Arrival in Essex. Outside, the truck rolled across the English countryside. Mark Davies followed the GPS coordinates to a quiet industrial estate in Essex. He pulled into a secluded lot behind a warehouse, parked the truck, and stepped out to stretch. He checked his phone. No messages. He was ahead of schedule. He leaned against the vehicle and lit a cigarette. Everything felt routine until the silence hit him. The refrigeration unit hummed quietly, but from inside the trailer nothing. Not a whisper, not a single knock. A black SUV soon pulled into the lot, headlights piercing the dark. It came to a stop near the truck. 2 men stepped out. One of them was Liam Carter Whitmore's right-hand man. The other was a stranger, tall, sharp features, silent. "You're early," Liam said, glancing at his watch. "Traffic was light," Mark replied, flicking his cigarette to the ground. "You got my money." Liam nodded, handing him a thick envelope. "Count it later. We need to unload." Mark glanced at the container. "Should I open it?" Liam shook his head. "We'll handle it." Mark stepped back. He was just the driver. Liam and the stranger approached the rear of the truck, unlocked the doors, and swung them open. The stench hit them instantly. A wave of heat and decay, sweat, urine, and death. Then they saw them. 50 bodies, slumped over each other, frozen in contorted agony. Some had clawed at the metal walls, leaving long scratches. Others died clutching loved ones, their fingers still intertwined. Liam recoiled. Jesus Christ, Mark's face turned pale. He had smuggled drugs, weapons, even people before. But this was something else entirely. "What do we do?" he asked, voice hoarse. Liam didn't answer. He pulled out his phone and dialed. Whitmore answered. "Is it done?" he asked calmly. Liam hesitated. "They're all dead." A pause, then a slow exhale. "Get rid of them. Clean it up," Whitmore said. The line went dead. Liam stared at the truck, then gave the order, "Burn it." The cover-up wind howled through the empty industrial lot. Mark stood frozen, heart pounding. "Burn it. Not hide it. Not bury it. Burn it." The stranger moved with quiet efficiency. He returned with a jerry can, the sharp scent of gasoline filling the air. He climbed into the trailer and poured fuel over the bodies. Mark gagged, turning away. He could still see their face, sister-twisted, desperate, lifeless. "You sure about this?" he asked. Liam gave him a cold look. You want to explain this to Whitmore? Mark fell silent. The stranger stepped back from the trailer. Liam pulled out a lighter, flicked it, then, without hesitation, tossed it into the container. A loud whoosh erupted as the flames roared to life. The fire consumed everything metal, flesh, hope. Thick black smoke curled into the cold night sky. Mark turned away, his stomach in knots. This wasn't a job gone wrong. It was a massacre, and he had been part of it. Erasing the evidence, Liam's voice cut through the roar of the flames. Get rid of your phone. Mark hesitated. Why? You made calls on it, sent texts. You want a trail? Mark reached into his pocket. His fingers tightened around the device. Then he tossed it into the fire. The plastic hissed as it melted. Liam nodded. Now get lost. Mark didn't wait. He turned and walked away, heart racing. He didn't look back. The aftermath of fire raged for hours by the time emergency services arrived. The truck was a blackened husk, twisted and warped by the flames. Firefighters worked in silence, the stench of burned flesh thick in the air. What they discovered inside would haunt them for years. A pile of charred, melted bodies fused together in a grotesque tangle of death. By sunrise, police had swarmed the scene. Forensic teams began combing through the wreckage, searching for any clues. Detective Eleanor Walsh arrived just after dawn. Her breath fogged in the crisp autumn air as she stepped closer to the scene. She'd seen a lot in her career, but nothing like this. What do we know? She asked the forensic officer. Not much, he replied grimly. No license plates, no identifiers. The fire wiped out most of the evidence. Walsh exhaled, rubbing her temples. She stared at the smoldering shell of the truck and the ashes of 50 lives that had ended in silent agony. The death toll was staggering, an estimated 50 lives lost. Victims of what appeared to be a large-scale human trafficking operation. Detective Eleanor Walsh stood silently at the edge of the scorched wreckage. She'd spent years chasing down smuggling rings, tracking the shadows that moved people like livestock across borders. But this was something else. This wasn't just cruelty. This was calculated murder, mass execution to hide the truth. She turned to a nearby officer. Any survivors? He hesitated. None that we've found, but he handed her a plastic evidence bag containing a small, melted object. A phone, burned, barely recognizable, but not completely destroyed. Walsh took it carefully, her instincts kicking in. If any data could be recovered from that phone, they might have a lead. She looked back at the blackened shell of the lorry. Whoever did this went to great lengths to erase their tracks. But she wasn't about to let them disappear without a trace. Mark Davies. The loose end Mark Davies sat alone in a dingy motel room on the outskirts of town. The flickering light from the TV played across his hollow face. His hands trembled as he poured another drink, the whiskey burning its way down his throat. He had seen the news. They'd found the truck, and they were looking for answers. His mind raced. He needed to run, but how? Whitmore's men would be watching. They didn't tolerate loose ends. Mark rubbed his face, exhaling shakily. There was no easy way out. And deep down, he knew it. The dead would follow him. He hadn't slept. The red glow of the motel's neon sign bled through the curtains, making the room feel suffocating and small. He stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror across the room's sunken eyes. Pale skin. A man unraveling. Every news channel played the same gruesome footage. Charred remains. Twisted metal. Investigators in hazmat suits. And behind every headline, human trafficking, mass murder, organized crime. And then came the nightmare. Authorities had managed to recover data from the melted phone. It was enough to trace recent calls, enough to point to him. If the police had that data, so did Whitmore. A knock at the door jolted him upright. Too soon for the police, they never knocked first. But Whitmore's men. That was different, heart pounding. Mark reached beneath the pillow, and pulled out a small pistol. His hands were slick with sweat as he cocked the hammer. Another knock. 3 quick raps. Then silence. He crept toward the door, placing his ear against it. Nothing. Then the doorknob turned. Panic surged. He stepped back, gun raised, breath caught in his throat. The door creaked open slowly. A woman stood there, early 30s, dark hair tied back, eyes sharp, scanning, dressed plainly jeans, and a jacket far too thin for the cold. "Mark Davies?" she asked, her voice low. His grip on the gun tightened. "Who the hell are you?" She glanced over her shoulder. "I don't have time to explain, but if you want to live, you need to come with me, right now." He didn't move. She stepped forward. "They found you. Whitmore's men are coming." His blood turned to ice. "How do you know?" She hesitated. "Because I used to work for him, Detective. Walsh closes in back at the station." Detective Walsh sat in her office, staring at the phone recovered from the scene. Despite the damage, her team had extracted fragments of data enough to trace a burner. Phone still active, registered to a seedy motel on the outskirts of town. She stared at the crime board across from her desk. Photographs, smuggling routes, shipping manifests, and 2 names at the center of it all: Liam Carter and Ronald Whitmore. She had spent years chasing Whitmore, a phantom. His empire spanned continents, drugs, weapons, humans, but this time he had slipped. He had left a trail, and if Mark Davies was still alive, he might be the key to bringing it all down. Walsh grabbed her coat and badge. It was time to move. Flight and Revelation Mark followed the woman Julia Reed through a narrow alley behind the motel. The air was cold, his breath misting in front of him. The street was quiet, but his nerves screamed. "Where are we going?" he whispered. "Somewhere safe," she replied, not turning back. He gave a bitter laugh. "I don't even know who you are." She stopped briefly. "Julia Reed. I worked logistics for Whitmore." Mark frowned. "Logistics?" "I tracked shipments, arranged transport, cleaned the books," she said quietly. "At least that's what I thought I was doing." Her voice darkened, "until I realized I was helping move people. Real people." Mark didn't need to ask. He knew. "Why help me?" Julia hesitated. "Because you're not like them." "You hesitated." Mark clenched his jaw. He wasn't sure that made him innocent, or just cowardly. They reached a rusted sedan parked under a flickering streetlight. "Get in," Julia said. He hesitated, then climbed in. She started the engine and pulled onto the road. Headlights off until they were far from the motel. Mark sat in silence, eyes scanning the road behind them. Then he asked, "You said you worked logistics. Does that mean you know where the next shipment is?" Her grip tightened on the wheel. "Yes." He inhaled sharply. For the first time in hours, he saw a way out. If he could give that information to Detective Walsh, he might have a shot at surviving this. The road to redemption asterisk. They drove in silence, the desolate roads stretching into darkness. Julia's mind churned, calculating the risks of what she had just done. This wasn't just about saving Mark, it was about saving herself, maybe even reclaiming the last sliver of her conscience. She had spent years helping Whitmore's empire thrive, moving money, moving bodies, turning a blind eye to the human cost. But now, every ghost she had ignored screamed in her memory, faces lost to ledgers, names replaced with numbers. She had seen the spreadsheets, lives reduced to lines in a logbook, but not anymore. Mark sat beside her, still and tense. His silence wasn't commit, was calculation. He had been complicit, maybe not hands-on, but he had known, and he had looked away, again and again, telling himself it was just a job, just another paycheck, that the guilt could be drowned with whiskey and sleep. But now, the consequences were crashing in around him, and the only way forward was through the fire they helped create. Part 1. He knew the damage was irreparable. The lives lost, the agony endured, could never be undone. The only thing left was to ensure it ended, even if that meant destroying himself along the way. Julia drove in silence, her mind mirroring his. The world outside the windshield was unnaturally still, as if the night itself was holding its breath. The deeper they drove into the wilderness, the darker the road became, twisting, narrowing, leading them further from the known and deeper into uncertainty. The safe house wasn't much, just a weathered cabin hidden in the woods. It was meant for quick disappearances, not prolonged refuge, but it would have to. As the car rolled to a halt, Julia exhaled shakily, her knuckles pale against the steering wheel. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what they carried. Mark stepped out, his boots crunching on gravel. The forest wrapped around them in silence, thick with pine and damp earth. Isolated, vulnerable. This was no sanctuary, this was the eye of the storm. Inside, under the dim glow of a single lamp, Julia laid out the stolen files across a rickety table. The documents were explosive. Names of buyers, trafficking routes, corrupt officials who'd been bought and silenced. Everything Whitmore had built, exposed and cold, undeniable black and white. Near the window, Mark stood guard, eyes scanning. The dark. Somewhere out there, Whitmore's men were hunting them. Somewhere, a clock ticked closer to their reckoning. They weren't just on the run, they were a threat to $1 billion empire, and Whitmore didn't let threats live. Julia knew the next step had to be perfect. A single misstep, and it was all over. She could feel the tension in her chest, suffocating, unforgiving, but necessary. The cabin creaked softly. The trees rustled outside. A wolf howled in the distance, long, mournful, a sound that seemed to stretch across centuries of violence. She looked at Mark. He looked back. No words were needed. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was war, and it had only just begun. Part to the Langley operation case, too. In the heart of Wisconsin, beneath the quiet facade of a working-class community, a sinister network thrived for years, hidden in plain sight. Its architect, a man whose name meant little to most, but whose actions left scars that would never fully heal. Victor Langley. He didn't appear in headlines until the day his empire crumbled, and the scale of what he had built came to light. Born in 1963, outside Milwaukee, Victor's childhood was unremarkable. His father worked in construction. His mother stayed home. There were no red flags, no childhood horrors, but appearances deceived by adulthood. Victor had crafted the perfect mask, a businessman, owner of a growing fleet of Midwest trucking companies. But behind the curtain was something far darker, a multi-state human trafficking network that used his trucking operation as its lifeline. It began in the late 90s, a one-off job. A friend of a friend needed help moving a small group of undocumented immigrants across the border. The money was quick, the risk minimal. Victor didn't hesitate, but one job became many. The demand was higher than he had imagined, and soon, he wasn't just moving people, he was selling them. For labor, for sex, for servitude. Langley's network was vast. He used long-haul trucks with hidden compartments. From the outside, they looked like vehicles hauling produce or manufacturing supplies. Inside, they were cages on wheels. People some no older than children were packed inside, like cargo. The routes changed constantly. So did the drop points. He paid off border agents, truck stop workers, even small-town sheriffs. Nobody talked, and those who did disappeared. For years, the operation thrived. Law enforcement whispered about a ghost pulling strings, but nothing stuck. Victor never signed anything, never used his name. Every communication was through burner phones. Transactions were handled by middlemen. But in 2015, he made a mistake. A traffic stop in Madison. Routine. one of Victor's trucks pulled over for a missing tail light. The trooper noticed something was off. The driver was nervous, sweating, unable to provide proper papers, and there was a smell, a strange, foul odor, from the trailer. What they found inside was a horror show. Over 30 people crammed in, barely conscious, starving, dehydrated. Some had been inside for days. They thought they were being taken to safety. Instead, they were prisoners. The bust cracked the case wide open. At first, the victims were too afraid to talk, but little by little, the truth surfaced. The network spanned the entire state, safe houses in remote farm towns, abandoned warehouses near old rail lines, corrupt local officials looking the other way, and, at the center of it all, Victor Langley. Still, it wasn't easy. He was a ghost. No records, no direct links. But federal agents began piecing it together: toll booth cameras, surveillance footage, intercepted phone calls. And one by one, Victor's own people turned against them. Drivers, couriers, brokers, all trading testimony for leniency. By 2017, the net was closing in. Victor booked a flight under a false name, hoping to disappear into Central America. But he never made it past the terminal. A team of federal agents was waiting. The arrest was quiet, surgical. Years of silence ended in seconds, but the damage was already done. The trial dragged on. Survivors testified stories of forced labor, sexual violence, starvation, and fear. Some described loved ones who vanished without a trace. The more they spoke, the clearer it became. What Victor had built wasn't just a trafficking ring. It was an empire of pain, in the end. Victor Langley was handed multiple life sentences. He would die in prison. But the wounds he left behind were still bleeding. For Wisconsin and, for the nation, it was a brutal wake-up call. One that exposed the ugly truth, that even in the quietest corners of America, evil can thrive. The fall of Victor Langley's trafficking empire. Victor Langley's arrest exposed deep vulnerabilities in border security, the trucking industry, and law enforcement's ability to detect and dismantle large-scale human smuggling operations. Even years after his capture, authorities continued to pursue the remnants of the vast trafficking network he had constructed, searching for those still lost in the system he once controlled. Langley's downfall marked the end of a chapter, but not the end of the war. His arrest had removed one powerful figure from the shadows, but the global machinery of human trafficking continued to churn. For every Victor Langley taken down, others stood ready to rise and replace him. What initially appeared to be a localized smuggling operation soon unraveled into a sprawling multi-state network, stretching from the southern U.S. border to remote wooded areas in Wisconsin and beyond. As the investigation deepened, it grew into one of the largest federal human trafficking cases in U.S. history. Multiple agencies were drawn in: the FBI, ICE, Homeland Security, and Wisconsin state law enforcement, all working together to unravel the empire Victor had built. The breakthrough came through the analysis of financial records and intercepted communications. Testimonies from former associates painted a chilling picture. Investigators discovered a string of storage facilities Victor had quietly leased under multiple aliases. These sites, scattered across Wisconsin and neighboring states, were disguised as abandoned warehouses. But inside, they were found to be holding sites, temporary prisons, for the human beings Victor smuggled across the border. Rows of makeshift beds, heaps of tattered clothing, and hidden compartments designed to conceal people during raids offered a grim view of just how efficiently the system was run. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed trucks coming and going at odd hours, never staying long, but always delivering or retrieving human cargo. The victims had often begun their journeys thousands of miles away, desperate for a better life. They placed their trust in, often their life savings, in the hands of smugglers, believing promises of safe passage or legitimate work opportunities in the U.S. Some sold their homes, Others borrowed from dangerous lenders. Once in Victor's system, they were trapped, stripped of autonomy, exploited, and funneled into forced labor, or in some cases, sex trafficking. Some were put to work in farms, factories, and restaurants for little or no pay. Others were sent into darker corners of the underground economy, subjected to unspeakable abuse. The lucky ones were eventually discarded, left in unfamiliar cities, with no money, no documents, and no way to return home. One of the most haunting discoveries was a hidden compound deep in the Wisconsin countryside, found only after agents traced obscure financial transactions. The property, surrounded by dense forest, was long abandoned by the time agents arrived. But inside, the evidence of human suffering remained. Small windowless rooms with reinforced locks, scattered personal items, and expired meal rations, all silent markers of the people who had once been held there. Even with Victor behind bars, authorities knew the case was far from over. Many of his associates vanished before they could be apprehended, some joining other trafficking rings, others disappearing entirely, waiting for law enforcement pressure to fade before resuming operations. Survivor testimonies proved critical to the prosecution. Victims spoke of betrayal and brutality, of how they were deceived into thinking they were chasing the American dream, only to find themselves in a waking nightmare. Their voices painted a portrait of a system built on greed, manipulation, and violence. Throughout the trial, Victor Langley remained composed, silent, and remorseless. Witness after witness recounted their suffering, but he showed no emotion. His crimes spanned human trafficking, money laundering, conspiracy, and numerous federal violations. The verdict was decisive: multiple life sentences. He would never walk free again. But justice, though served, could never undo the damage. Families were left shattered. Survivors faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives. The case laid bare the systemic failures that had allowed such atrocities to continue unchecked for so long. In the years that followed, Victor's case became a template for future investigations. His empire, once impenetrable, was now a case study in how traffickers operate beneath the surface of ordinary life. Authorities adapted their tactics, using what they had learned to target similar operations nationwide. But the fight was far from over. The demand for cheap labor and illicit services continued, and for every trafficker caught, others rose to replace them. Victor Langley's fall became a chilling symbol of the hidden darkness in modern society. His organization had crumbled, but the war against human trafficking, fueled by desperation, greed, and systemic indifference, was a battle that would never truly end. Yet, Victor hadn't always been the criminal mastermind that headlines portrayed. In the beginning, he was a middleman, a cog in the wheel of a sprawling underground network that specialized in illegal immigration. He learned the trade under more experienced traffickers, studying how the system could be exploited. But he was different: ambitious, intelligent, and above all, ruthless. Where others saw danger, Victor saw opportunity. He approached human trafficking not as a crime, but as a business. He optimized routes like supply chains, created layers of plausible deniability, and insulated himself from risk. By the early 2000s, he had broken away from his mentors and built his own operation, one that moved people deep into the country, far from the watchful eyes of border agents and city police. Wisconsin became the heart of his empire. Its remote rural landscape allowed him to purchase properties, some under fake names, others through shell corporations, where smuggled individuals were processed, housed, and redistributed. But Victor didn't stop at transportation. He found ways to profit from every phase of the pipeline. Families paid steep fees to get their loved ones across the border, only to be extorted further once they arrived. Those who couldn't pay were forced into labor, feeding Victor's shadow economy. For years, law enforcement had little more than rumors and suspicions. Victor was meticulous, using burner phones, encrypted messaging, and intermediaries to handle the dirty work. Those who crossed him had a tendency to disappear permanently. The turning point came with the emergence of a key witness referred to only as Daniel in court records. A former insider, Daniel had been deeply embedded in Victor's inner circle. His testimony cracked open the case. Through him, investigators gained unprecedented access to the inner workings of the trafficking ring, the logistics, the locations, the aliases, and the financial shell games Victor used to stay untouchable. Daniel's bravery and the tireless work of agents, survivors, and journalists finally brought down an empire built on misery. But the scars remain, and while Victor Langley may be gone, the shadow he cast still looms over the ongoing fight against human trafficking. Daniel had once been Victor Langley's most trusted enforcer, a man who operated at the core of the trafficking empire. But, over time, the brutality became impossible to ignore. He had watched too many lives destroyed, people reduced to mere commodities, their worth determined solely by how much profit they could generate. He had seen the holding facilities, where terrified individuals were crammed into windowless rooms, waiting to be sold. Some were trafficked into forced labor. Others disappeared into far darker markets. Those who resisted were punished, beaten, starved, or worse. When Daniel finally came forward, his testimony changed everything. He handed investigators the blueprint to Victor's operation, transportation routes, safe houses, names, and roles. Armed with this information, federal agents launched a wave of coordinated raids across several states. Dozens of victims were rescued, and Victor's vast storage facilities were shut down. But it was what they uncovered in the woods of Wisconsin that stunned even the most seasoned officers. There, hidden behind thick forest and fortified fences, was a heavily guarded compound. Inside, agents found over 40 people, men, women, even children, malnourished, terrified, and showing clear signs of abuse. Some had been imprisoned for weeks, others for months, awaiting their final destinations. Ledgers uncovered in the compound revealed just how expansive Victor's network had become, its reach extending far beyond initial estimates. With Daniel's testimony and a mountain of physical evidence, Victor Langley was brought to trial. The case made national headlines, pulling the hidden world of domestic human trafficking into the public eye. Prosecutors painted Victor as a man who built an empire on suffering, who targeted the vulnerable for personal gain. Survivors took the stand. One woman told the court how she'd been lured with the promise of a nanny job, only to be enslaved in a wealthy household. Another described being locked in a basement for weeks, awaiting sale. Victor sat through it all without emotion, no reaction to the evidence, no response to the stories, not even when former allies testified against him. He had spent years believing he was untouchable. Even in chains, he seemed unwilling to acknowledge the horrors he had orchestrated. In the end, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty on all counts: human trafficking, conspiracy, and financial crimes. The judge handed down the maximum sentence. Victor Langley would never be free again. But while justice had been served in court, the damage couldn't be undone. The scars he left behind ran far deeper than any prison term could heal. Many of Victor's victims faced a new battle after their rescue. They had spent years living in fear, stripped of their identities and basic human rights. Some were trafficked so young they couldn't remember life before captivity. Others had fled danger in their home countries, only to find a nightmare waiting for them in the U.S. without legal status or family. And with little support, many struggled to rebuild. Government programs offered shelters, legal aid, and therapy, but these resources were limited. Some lived in fear of deportation. Others, lacking alternatives, were drawn back into the very cycle of exploitation they had escaped. Among Victor's seized records was a chilling section titled "Disappeared," a list of names without destinations. Investigators feared the worst, that these people had vanished into black market industries, even harder to trace. Some may have been killed, their bodies discarded where no one would ever find them. Victor's downfall was just the beginning. His case revealed how deep the roots of human trafficking ran within the U.S. economy. One name that appeared repeatedly in his documents was Marshall and Levinson Freight Company, a major shipping business based in Illinois. On the surface, it was a legitimate transportation firm. In reality, it was a vital artery in Victor's empire. Undercover agents infiltrated the company. What they found was damning: altered manifests, bribed inspectors, and trailers outfitted with hidden compartments to smuggle people undetected across state lines. Marshall and Levinson wasn't just complicit, they were actively involved. Victor hadn't built his network alone. He relied on corrupt officials, facilitators, and even reputable companies that had either knowingly or blindly enabled him, and many of them kept operating even after his arrest. One of Victor's most disturbing innovations was known as the Northern Passage, a smuggling route that bypassed heavily monitored southern borders. Victims were transported through Canada, then into the U.S. via remote crossings. The journey was brutal. Many trekked for miles in sub-zero temperatures. Some never made it, their bodies swallowed by the wilderness. Shockingly, records showed this route had been used for nearly a decade. Victor's capture created a power vacuum. Rival traffickers, former lieutenants, and external criminal groups scrambled to claim pieces of his empire. Law enforcement now faced a race against time. Every delay allowed new players to gain ground. Agents launched sting operations, tracked financial trails, and dismantled safe houses, but the reality was clear. This wasn't just Victor's empire, it was a system, and that system was still alive. His case became a symbol of both horror and hope. It exposed the darkest corners of society, where profit came from pain. But it also revealed the strength of those who chose to fight, the survivors who testified, the agents who refused to give up, and the insiders like Daniel who finally spoke out. Victor Langley may have faded into the shadows of a maximum security prison, but the war he waged still raged on. A war that, for too many, never truly ends. Even after Victor Langley was taken down, the system didn't collapse, it adapted. As one trafficking ring was dismantled, another quietly emerged in its place. The demand never went away. Cheap labor, illicit services, desperate people willing to risk everything. That hunger for exploitation remained, feeding a network that never truly slept. Victor Langley may have been defeated, but the war raged on. Long after his sentencing, Victor's name echoed in the shadows of the underworld. Among some, he was a cautionary tale, proof that no one, no matter how powerful, was untouchable. To others, he became a martyr of sorts, crushed by a system more corrupt than he ever was. But to his victims, he was something far more terrifying. He was the man who stole their lives, who turned dreams into nightmares. And while he rotted in a cell, many of his victims still fought to reclaim the fragments of a stolen past. Some survivors found purpose in their pain. They spoke at rallies. They lobbied for stronger laws. They worked with advocacy groups to support others who had endured the same horrors. But others disappeared into society's margins, too broken to rebuild, too traumatized to be found. Some turned to crime, repeating the very cycles they had been victims of. Others simply faded from memory, their stories untold, their fates unknown. Victor Langley's downfall didn't bring closure. It revealed just how deeply the rot had spread. The trafficking empire he built didn't die with him, it fractured. Splinter groups formed. Some of his lieutenants disappeared into the shadows, erasing connections and covering tracks. Others scrambled to seize control of the remnants, hungry for power. For law enforcement, the work was far from over. As the pursuit deepened, investigators uncovered a vast web of corruption and complicity. This was no longer about a single trafficker. The system itself was infected, from shady business owners to high-level officials. Victor's operation had been propped up by people who were supposed to protect the vulnerable, but instead exploited them. One of the most shocking revelations was the involvement of Michael Henshaw, a senior immigration officer in Chicago. He had provided fraudulent documents, allowing hundreds of trafficked individuals to move through the system unnoticed. In return, he pocketed massive bribes, funneled through offshore shell companies. For years, Henshaw operated with near impunity. He buried reports, falsified records, redirected investigations. His downfall came from a single oversight, an unusual transaction flagged by a Schmid, financial analyst. When Henshaw was arrested, it sent shockwaves through law enforcement circles. He had been a public advocate against illegal immigration, all while profiting from the very system he claimed to fight. Testimonies from victims and junior officers who'd unknowingly processed his documents painted a damning portrait. But Henshaw was just the tip of the iceberg. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became. The rot was systemic. Border agents, city administrators, government contractors. Some had been bribed, others threatened. Many just saw dollar signs and rationalized their actions as just another transaction in a world already drowning in corruption. As the remnants of Victor's network were hunted down, one question loomed: what about the people still trapped inside it? Victor's ledgers listed thousands of names, but not all of them were accounted for. Survivors spoke of smuggling routes that had been abandoned or rerouted after Victor's arrest. Some were left stranded in safe houses, no money, no ID, no idea where they were or how to get home. Others were sold off quickly, traded to rival networks before authorities could intervene. One such tragedy unfolded in a Milwaukee warehouse. 37 individuals, all trafficked from Eastern Europe, were discovered locked inside a storage unit. They'd been left there after Victor's operation was disrupted. With no food, no water, several had already died of dehydration when they were found. The survivors, some just 7 years old, were barely clinging to life. It was a brutal reminder. Victor Langley's empire was never about one man. It was a sprawling machine fueled by human misery, and even as he sat behind bars, many of his victims remained lost. The legal proceedings dragged on for years. Dozens of associates were charged, from transport coordinators to accountants who laundered his money. But while the courts handed down verdicts, the survivors were left to navigate the wreckage. Many had no legal status, no documents, no resources. Some were shuffled into shelters, stuck in legal limbo. Others were deported back to the countries they had fled, returning not to safety, but to danger. The trauma ran deep. Some couldn't even speak about what they had endured. Others tried to rebuild, but the scars, physical and emotional, were permanent. And for those who had profited from Victor's empire, the wealthy clients who benefited from cheap labor, the silent investors insulated by legal loopholes, the consequences were almost non-existent. They had made sure their names never appeared on paper, and the system protected them. Even as the headlines faded, human trafficking thrived. Victor Langley was gone, but the demand remained, and new traffickers were already rising, more cautious, more sophisticated. Having learned from Victor's downfall, for law enforcement, it became painfully clear they had only scratched the surface. The structures that enabled Victor still existed, and as long as there was profit in suffering, someone would always step in to fill the void. Case Thierry Under, the relentless son of Arizona's unforgiving deserts. A new trafficker rose. Victor Salazar, born in 1971, to a struggling immigrant family in Tucson, Victor grew up learning to survive in a world that offered little mercy. By his late 20s, he had carved out a reputation not just as a smuggler, but as a businessman, a strategist, and a master manipulator. His empire stretched from Central America to the southern border of the United States. But unlike the chaotic operations of his peers, Salazar's network ran with chilling precision. Unlike the violent cartels that ruled the drug trade with brutality, Victor Salazar built his empire on strategy, secrecy, and manipulation. His operation didn't rely on bloodshed, it thrived on deception, well-placed informants, and a network of corrupt officials. He saw the desperation of those fleeing poverty and violence in their homelands, and he turned that desperation into a profitable enterprise. They called it the Phantom Passage, a human smuggling ring so elusive that even veteran agents struggled to track it. At the peak of his reign, Victor ran an intricate system of transport routes, fortified safe houses, and expertly forged documents, enabling thousands of migrants to cross into the United States undetected. His network wasn't just efficient, it was surgical. Modified freight trucks with hidden compartments, decoy convoys posing as humanitarian aid, and treacherous desert paths guided by skilled trackers all were orchestrated under his command. He secured alliances with street gangs, logistics experts, and even law enforcement officials on the take. But his most audacious plan came in the summer of 2012. Victor orchestrated what would go down as the largest human smuggling attempt in Arizona's history. Over 200 individuals transported across the border in a single operation. It was a logistical nightmare, requiring every connection, every bribe, and every layer of subterfuge he had cultivated over the years. The plan involved multiple transport phases, decoy trucks, temporary desert holding camps, and forged travel documents distributed with assembly line efficiency. His lieutenants spent weeks prepping, scouting patrol movements, and stashing water, medical supplies, and emergency shelters along the most dangerous stretch, the Arizona desert. On the night of the operation, everything appeared flawless. The first wave of transports crossed without issue. Border Patrol presence was minimal. Decoy vehicles had drawn surveillance away from the real movement. Victor's network moved like clockwork. But what he didn't know was that federal agents had already been watching him for months. A recent intelligence leak had shifted U.S. surveillance priorities, and a federal task force had quietly been tracking his every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came just before dawn. The first vehicle, a truck near Yuma, was intercepted, packed with over 50 migrants in suffocating conditions. The driver fled, but was quickly captured. Within hours, more vehicles were stopped. What began as a crack in the armor triggered a domino effect. Highways were swarmed with law enforcement, and safe houses were raided in rapid succession. In Phoenix, Victor listened to the radio silence from his transport teams, watched unmarked vehicles surround his properties, and received panicked calls from associates. His empire, built in the shadows, was collapsing in real time. Still, Victor wasn't the type to surrender. He had contingency plans, multiple fake identities, offshore accounts, and escape routes carefully laid out. But this time was different. This time the net was too tight. The feds weren't just arresting drivers, they were tearing down the infrastructure. The biggest blow came with the arrest of Marco Velasquez, Victor's top lieutenant, and the logistical brain behind the entire network. Marco wasn't built to withstand interrogation, and Victor knew that once the agents got to him, the secrets would spill. Meanwhile, raids spread across the state. Warehouses in Phoenix, desert motels near Nogales, remote safe houses in barren landscapes. Dozens of migrants were found crammed into rooms, some dehydrated, others barely clinging to consciousness. Their testimonies painted a haunting picture of an operation that promised salvation, but often delivered them into danger and suffering. The Phantom Passage had become a federal priority. Press headlines declared it the largest human smuggling bust in Arizona's history. The Department of Homeland Security wanted a high-profile takedown, and they were getting it. Victor escaped Phoenix using a forged identity and help from officials who still owed him favors. His destination, the Mexican border. If he could vanish into cartel-controlled territory, he could disappear a build. But crossing into Mexico meant depending on the very cartels he had long avoided. They didn't forget betrayal, and they didn't show mercy as he neared the border. Victor began to notice the signs tightened checkpoints, facial recognition cameras, and increasing reports of federal and local collaboration. Every escape route seemed blocked. In desperation, he contacted a former ally, a man known only as El Pastor, a ranking figure in the Kaloa cartel, who had once facilitated special crossings for Victor's elite clients. But El Pastor had no patience for fugitives. The moment Victor reached out, he sensed it. He was no longer a partner. He was a liability. By the time Victor reached the outskirts of Navajoa, he realized he was being followed. A black SUV trailed him for miles, never overtaking, never falling back. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he pulled into a deserted gas station, trying to anticipate what was coming. If they were federal agents, they'd wait. If they were cartel enforcers, he might not even make it out of the car. The SUV pulled alongside him. A man stepped out, black sunglasses, unreadable expression, and for the first time in his life, Victor Salazar felt truly cornered. His empire was gone. His allies had abandoned him, and now, alone at the edge of the desert he once controlled, he realized there was no way out. The night air was still, heavy, silent. Victor sat motionless, knuckles white against the steering wheel, every instinct screaming for him to act. But knowing that any move could be his last, he took a breath, opened the door, and stepped into the unknown. Victor didn't speak right away. When he finally did, his voice was low, measured, almost indifferent, but the man standing before him wasn't fooled. Victor knew better than to respond with arrogance. He played the only card he had left, cooperation. A slow nod was all he gave in acknowledgement of his situation, if not outright surrender. The man made no visible reaction. He simply turned and gestured toward the SUV. The message was clear. Get in. Victor hesitated only for a fraction of a second before complying. He had no choice. The moment the door shut behind him, the SUV pulled away from the gas station and slipped into the vast darkness of the Arizona desert. The silence in the vehicle was deafening. Victor could hear his own breathing, the hum of the tires against asphalt, the faint rustle as one of the men adjusted in his seat. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The tension in that car was thick enough to choke on. They drove for what felt like hours, the landscape outside growing increasingly barren. Victor, a veteran of Arizona's smuggling routes, recognized the path they were headed, toward the outskirts of Nogales, deep into cartel-controlled territory. When the vehicle finally slowed and stopped, Victor's pulse quickened. He was yanked from the car and led toward a dimly lit warehouse, its steel siding weathered, its air thick with the scent of oil and sweat. Inside, several men stood waiting, their faces obscured by shadow, and then Victor saw him. El Pastor, the cartel boss, stood at the center of the room, dressed simply in a white button-down shirt, sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. His calm, composed presence commanded the entire space. Victor had met him before, but never like this. Their previous dealings had been professional, neutral. Now, Victor was no longer a partner. He was a liability. El Pastor said nothing at first, studying Victor in a silence that felt like a verdict. When he finally spoke, his words sent a chill straight through Victor's spine. This wasn't a negotiation, this was judgment. For decades, Victor had manipulated systems, deceived allies, evaded the law. But here, in the heart of the very world he had exploited, he was utterly at their mercy. As El Pastor took a step forward, the other men in the room tensed. The air shifted. Every movement from this point on would have consequences. Victor had made men disappear in places like this. Now he was the one with nowhere left to run. A single nod from El Pastor, and one of the guards stepped forward, placing a thick manila folder on the table. Victor didn't need to look, he already knew what it held. Names, routes, transactions, evidence of betrayal. It wasn't just information, It was a ledger of lives. El Pastor finally spoke again, calm and deliberate. His tone didn't need theatrics, just the gravity of finality. Victor's mind scrambled. The feds had moved faster than expected. His network had sprung leaks. Someone inside his operation had either failed or betrayed him. He didn't bother pleading. He'd seen what happened to men who tried to justify their mistakes. They never finished their sentences. Instead, he took a steady breath and gave the only answer he could. They had to find the leak. Someone inside had to be working with law enforcement. He scanned the room faces he once trusted, now possible. Traitors. Moments later, Miguel entered. His face was tense. The police have already started questioning the migrants, he said. It's only a matter of time before they get something. Victor didn't wait. He grabbed his jacket and signaled. Miguel, they had to move. If law enforcement was closing in, they needed to know what the authorities had and shut it down before it spread. They climbed into a second SUV, tearing off into the desert night. The clock was ticking. Case FOU, our Cambodia, 2016, in the dense, humid jungles where the Hmong River winds past ancient temples and forgotten villages. A darker current was flowing beneath the surface. A vast and secretive trafficking network thrived, one that fed off desperation, dreams, and broken promises. At its center stood a man known as Samchai Vera, ghost-like figure, as elusive as the mist that clung to the Cambodian treetops. Born into a modest family in Phnom Penh, Samchai's early life was marked by poverty. His father, a fisherman, tried to instill honest values, but the lure of the black market proved stronger. By his late teens, Samchai was smuggling contraband across Thailand and Vietnam, illegal timber, rare wildlife, whatever turned a profit. But the most lucrative commodity was human lives. What began as transporting a few desperate workers across the border to labor in sweatshops quickly evolved into a multinational trafficking empire. By 2010, Samchai had built a vast network stretching from Cambodia to Laos, Vietnam, and even into Malaysia. His men operated like shadows, moving people through fishing boats, hollowed-out truck compartments, and even tunnels under border checkpoints. Their promise was always the same: a better life, jobs in casinos, hotels, and factories. But the reality was far grimmer. Some victims paid willingly, believing they were investing in their future. Others were snatched from bus stations, night markets, or isolated villages where law enforcement held no sway. Once in Samchai's grip, they were bound by detanned by force. Men toiled in sweatshops and on fishing trawlers that never returned to shore. Women were trafficked into underground brothels. Any who resisted were beaten, starved, or worse. Despite growing suspicion, Samchai remained virtually untouchable. His reach extended into law enforcement, immigration, even border control. He masked his empire behind charities, schools, and religious donations, buying public goodwill while expanding his grip on the region. He didn't just build a trafficking network, he built a myth. And for years, that myth kept him invisible. But every empire built on shadows eventually faces the light. He was hailed as a generous benefactor, a man of the people. Samchai Verik, the billionaire philanthropist, known for funding schools, hospitals, and temples across Cambodia. But beneath the surface of his charity empire, a far darker truth was festering. For years, rumors swirled in hushed circles, whispers of missing persons, unidentified bodies, and graves hidden in remote jungles. The few journalists brave enough to investigate either vanished, retracted their stories, or suffered sudden accidents. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses went silent. Samchai was methodical, ensuring every loose end was tied before it could threaten him. But in 2015, the cracks finally began to show. Her name was Dara Men, an investigative journalist who had spent years piecing together scattered reports, missing persons cases, vague police files, anonymous tips. Unlike the many silenced before her, Dara had something Samchai's victims didn't: a platform, powerful allies, and a fire that couldn't be extinguished. She had been watching, waiting until the mistake came. It started with a single truck, a repurposed freight vehicle, part of Samchai's underground operation, was transporting 32 people, men, women, and children, across the Cambodian-Vietnamese border. Their destination: forced labor camps in Malaysia. Every movement of the network was typically orchestrated with military precision. Routes were well mapped, border officials were bribed. But this time, a low-level smuggler, desperate to prove his worth, went off-script, veering off the known path, chasing shortcuts through unfamiliar terrain. The truck was found the next morning, abandoned in a jungle clearing, its back doors wide open. Inside, a nightmare. Half-starved, dehydrated captives, too weak to flee, lay slumped against metal walls, stained with bodily fluids. Others had escaped into the forest, alerting nearby farmers who contacted local authorities. What they discovered was damning. Word of the find quickly reached Dara. This wasn't just another rumor. This was proof. With the help of international human rights groups, she traced the truck to a shell company, its owner, Samchai Varik. The connection was no longer speculation. It was real, tangible, and the survivors were willing to speak. One by one, they shared their stories of being promised legitimate jobs in neighboring countries, only to have their passports confiscated, their freedom stolen. They had been sold, worked to the brink of death, starved, beaten. Many had watched fellow captives die slowly in front of them, their bodies discarded like trash. The international community erupted. Humanitarian organizations sounded alarms. Embassies demanded accountability. The Cambodian government, long accused of turning a blind eye, could no longer ignore the pressure. And Samchai panicked. He began liquidating assets, closing warehouses, silencing former associates. But his desperate scramble only attracted more scrutiny. Each move he made exposed a new piece of the puzzle. The web was unraveling. Then came the raid, backed by Dara's intelligence and accounts from whistleblowers. A joint task force was assembled: Cambodian special forces, working in tandem with international operatives. Their target, one of Samchai's central trafficking hubs, hidden deep in the jungle. What they found was not a hideout. It was a human warehouse. The compound was fortified, ringed with barbed wire, manned by ex-military guards, and camouflaged beneath the trees. By dawn, the task force had breached the outer walls. A firefight erupted. Bullets tore through the foliage. Explosions echoed through the jungle. The defenders, many ex-mercenaries, fought savagely. They knew the penalty for capture. Inside, the horror defied belief. Dozens of victims, many emaciated and ill, huddled in makeshift cells. Beneath the estate, operatives discovered a network of underground tunnel stamp, narrow corridors crammed with human misery. Victims were shackled, many in cages barely large enough to sit upright. Some were children, barely old enough to speak. Others had lost the ability to speak entirely. One soldier later described the air as unbreathable, thick with decay, urine, and hopelessness. By sunrise, the facility was secured. Over 100 people were rescued. Dozens of traffickers were captured or killed. But Samchai was gone. He had vanished into the forest, just ahead of the raid. Investigators found a concealed escape tunnel stocked with food, weapons, and forged documents. He had prepared for this. Authorities fanned out through the jungle, but he slipped through every net, a ghost among shadows. Rumors swirled. Some said he escaped to Thailand, protected by corrupt officials. Others believed he was hiding in plain sight, shielded by his vast network. Weeks passed, then months. The empire had crumbled, but its architect remained free. Survivors were left to pick up the pieces. Many had no families to return to, no homes, no names in any system. Their very identities had been erased. Dara continued to fight. She documented survivor testimonies, exposed systemic corruption. Her work garnered global attention, sparking protests, policy reviews, and a reckoning within Southeast Asia's human trafficking response. But one truth remained. Samchai Varik, mastermind of one of the largest human trafficking networks in modern history, was still out there, and as long as he was, the shadow he cast would never fully lift. Interpol issued a red notice. His image was splashed across news bulletins. He was now one of the most wanted men in the world, but the jungle remembers his footsteps, and justice is still hunting. Samchai had vanished without a trace. Authorities speculated he had slipped across borders through the same underground smuggling routes he once commanded. Some believed he was hiding in Thailand, protected by corrupt officials. Others pointed to Myanmar's lawless borderlands and thriving black markets as his likely refuge. Sightings trickled in from across Southeast Asia, blurry CCTV image from Bangkok. A shadowy figure in a Saukville casino, an informant who claimed he saw him boarding a private vessel off Vietnam's coast. But each promising lead dissolved into another dead end, while investigators scrambled to locate him. The survivors of Samchai's trafficking empire were left to navigate a fractured existence. Many had been taken from poor villages, stripped of identity, and sold into bondage. With no families left to return to, they were adrift in a world that had moved unforgotten by the system, haunted by their past. Dharam, the journalist who first exposed the network, refused to let the story fade. She journeyed to remote communities, spoke to grieving families, and interviewed survivors who had clawed their way out of Samchai's brutal web. Their stories were harrowing. One survivor, Chan, had been only 17 when she was lured with promises of restaurant work in Phnom Penh. Instead, she was sold into a brothel run by Samchai's syndicate. For years, she was passed from client to client, beaten and drugged whenever she resisted. By the time she was rescued, her body bore the evidence of years of abuse scars etched into her skin. Her voice reduced to a whisper. There were hundreds of stories like Chan's, each one a testament to the cruelty of Samchai's regime. Yet, even as the world denounced him, Cambodia's trafficking crisis remained unchanged. New criminals filled the vacuum he left behind: former associates, corrupt officials, and opportunistic predators eager to claim his throne. Then, nearly 2 years after the dramatic raid on Samchai's compound, came a breakthrough. A man was arrested at Kuala Lumpur airport, attempting to travel on a fake passport. His appearance had been altered: plastic surgery, new identity, but his fingerprints told the truth. It was Samchai Varik. He had been living in Malaysia under the protection of a powerful crime syndicate, quietly rebuilding his empire, this time trafficking victims from South Asia and Africa into illegal labor markets across Malaysia and Indonesia. His downfall came not from international manhunts, but from arrogance. He thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. Within days of the arrest, an extradition request was filed. Samchai was flown back to Cambodia under heavy guard. As he stepped off the plane in Phnom Penh, he was met by a media frenzy and by the survivors he had once enslaved. Their expressions were a mix of fury and vindication. In court, Samchai remained silent as a flood of charges was read out: human trafficking, kidnapping, torture, murder. The prosecution laid out a mountain of evidence: survivor testimony, financial records, security footage, and intercepted communications. He offered no defense. Perhaps he knew no words could erase what he had done. After a lengthy trial, the verdict was clear: life in prison without parole. For survivors, it was a moment of long-awaited justice, but not closure. Many continued to battle trauma, their nights filled with memories they could not escape. Some turned their pain into purpose, joining advocacy groups and speaking out. Others faded quietly into anonymity, trying to piece together lives that had been stolen from them. Dharam's profile grew. Now, an internationally respected journalist, She used her platform to expose the wider web of human trafficking that still flourished in Cambodia. She understood. Samchai's conviction was a victory, but only one battle in a much larger war, because wherever poverty thrived, wherever corruption lingered, traffickers would rise from the shadows. And just as one empire fell, another began to emerge. Her name was Shay Shamran. Unlike Samchai, Shay was elusive and calculated. One of his former top lieutenants, she had managed cross-border movement and financial laundering for the syndicate. While others were arrested or killed in the crackdown, Shay vanished. She forged a new identity and slipped into the shadows. Whispers of her whereabouts circulated. Some said she fled to China, connecting with crime networks specializing in forced labor. Others believed she had returned to Cambodia, blending into the upper echelons of Phnom Penh's elite. Meanwhile, people began disappearing again. Young women promised jobs. Families searching for sons who vanished after interviews abroad. Shamran's methods were different. She avoided large-scale trafficking. Instead, she catered to high clients, politicians, businessmen, criminal elites running operations in discreet, decentralized cells. That made her far harder to trace. Dharam redirected her investigation toward this new threat. Through her sources, she uncovered a chilling pattern: unconnected disappearances from rural Cambodia to Bangkok. The victims were often teenagers, lured by fraudulent job offers, then swallowed by a silent network. One case struck her deeply: a girl named Neri, missing from Weeks after her disappearance, her family received a brief, trembling voice message. She claimed to be working at a restaurant in Bangkok, but her words were rehearsed, her tone edged with fear. After that silence, Dharam retraced Neri's last known steps, following leads to border towns where traffickers smuggled victims into Thailand. She spoke with insiders, walked the alleyways, and pursued the paper trail, determined to uncover the truth and to expose the woman now rising where Samchai once stood. The war against human trafficking was far from over, but as long as voices like Dharam's refused to be silenced, there was still hope that the shadows could be brought into the light. Case for the ghost of Sacha Maronin. Her investigation into trafficking across Southeast Asia. Dara uncovered a chilling lead. Had been taken to a compound outside Pattaya, Thailand. This location was rumored to be one of Shamran's newly established trafficking hubs. With mounting evidence, Dara alerted the authorities, but her pleas were met with delays, indifference, and fear. Some officials worried about retaliation from the criminal networks still deeply embedded in the system. Others saw no incentive to pursue a case that could bring them more trouble than benefit. Frustrated, but undeterred, Dara took matters into her own hands. She partnered with a group of local activists who specialized in the covert rescue of trafficking victims. Together, they launched an undercover operation, planting hidden cameras and embedding informants to infiltrate the compound. What they uncovered was worse than anyone had anticipated. Inside the compound, dozens of victims were being held against their will. Some had been there for months, others for years. They were starved, beaten, and conditioned into silence. Many had been trafficked for forced labor, while others had endured far darker abuses. Among them was Neri. The rescue was swift but chaotic. As the activists led victims to safety, gunfire rang out in the distance. Shamran's private security had been alerted. Amid the chaos, Shamran vanished, slipping away into the night, just as her former employer once had. Neri was eventually reunited with her family, but the trauma lingered. Her childhood was gone, her dreams shattered. She, like so many others, had been reduced to a commodity by those who profited from human suffering. Dara's expose on Shamran's network sent shockwaves through the region. International pressure mounted on Cambodian and Thai authorities to take real action against trafficking. For the first time, change seemed possible, but Shamran remained at large. She had learned from her predecessor Samai's mistakes. Where he relied on violence and fear, Shemran thrived in silence. She built a trafficking empire in the shadows, aligning with corrupt officials, business tycoons, and digital syndicates. She became nearly untouchable. Authorities pursued her relentlessly, but each time they got close, she vanished, always one step ahead. Survivors were too terrified to speak, and those who did ended up missing or dead. Still, Dara pressed on. She traveled through border towns in Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand, chasing every whisper of Shemran's operations. In abandoned safe houses, she found walls that still bore the marks of chains. Villagers spoke of unmarked trucks moving by night, carrying human cargo to destinations unknown. Shemran's reach was vast, far beyond what anyone had imagined. By 2025, a breakthrough finally came. A young man named Vichu, a former victim who had escaped one of Shemran's facilities, agreed to testify. Unlike many survivors, Vichu wanted justice. He gave detailed accounts of recruitment methods, trafficking routes, and the horrific conditions inside the compounds. His testimony opened the floodgates. Authorities launched a massive international sting operation across Cambodia, Thailand, and the Philippines. Over 200 arrests were made. Dozens of victims were rescued. Vast amounts of digital evidence were seized, proof that Shemran's empire had extended into online exploitation, too. But Shemran herself was gone. Some believed she had fled to China, forming alliances with powerful crime syndicates. Others claimed she'd undergone surgery, changed her appearance, and assumed a new identity. Some whispered she had simply vanished into the murky depths of a world where those with enough power could erase their past. For Dara, the years of chasing ghosts had taken a toll. She had dedicated her life to exposing the machinery of exploitation, but with each victory came a deeper understanding of just how vast and unstoppable the trafficking industry had become. Still, she continued, not because she believed she could stop it overnight, but because every story told, every truth exposed, was one more crack in the walls built by monsters like Shem. And maybe, just maybe, one day those walls would collapse. Case 5. The shipping king of Darwo, Ian Darwin, a quiet port city in northern Australia, became the unlikely epicenter of one of the nation's most horrifying human trafficking networks. With its vast waters, strategic location, and relatively loose maritime oversight, it had long been a favored entry point for smugglers. At the heart of it all stood Victor Langford. Born in Sydney in 1970, Victor came from a stable middle-class background. His father worked in shipping logistics. His mother was a teacher. But Victor always wanted more power, more wealth, more control. He had no patience for the limits of legality. His early career followed a legitimate path through shipping and freight. But by the late 1990s, Victor saw the shadows as more profitable than the spotlight. He forged connections with Southeast Asian criminal organizations, particularly in Indonesia, Cambodia, and Thailand. He began by smuggling contraband, untaxed cigarettes, alcohol, even exotic animals. But soon, he shifted to human cargo. It was a lucrative transition by the early 2000s. Victor was moving hundreds of desperate migrants from impoverished villages across Asia, lured by promises of a better life in Australia, using a fleet of cargo ships registered under shell companies in Panama and Singapore. He orchestrated a highly sophisticated human smuggling operation. Conditions aboard were brutal. Migrants were packed into sealed containers with no ventilation. Some traveled for weeks without adequate food or sanitation. Many died before ever reaching Australian shores. Those who survived were left stranded in Darwin without legal status, housing, or protection, making them ripe for exploitation. Despite growing suspicion from authorities, Victor remained a step ahead. He bribed customs officers, used encrypted channels, regularly altered routes, His network was airtight, but as the death toll of smuggled migrants grew, so did international scrutiny. In 2010, a breakthrough occurred when an undercover operative successfully penetrated one of Victor Langford's trusted smuggling networks in Indonesia. The intelligence uncovered triggered a sweeping investigation. Over the following 2 years, authorities were able to connect multiple disappearances across Southeast Asia to the sudden rise in undocumented migrants arriving in Darwin, Australia. Using that intel, law enforcement agencies began closely monitoring Victor's every move, tracking financial transactions, surveillance footage, and cross-border communications to build a map of his syndicate's vast operations. By 2013, the pieces were in place. The Australian Border Force, working in coordination with Interpol and Indonesian police, launched Operation Nightfall, a multinational sting targeting several key nodes of Victor's empire. In Darwin, agents stormed a private dock as one of Victor's vessels arrived under cover of night, offloading what appeared to be cargo. But inside those heavily modified shipping containers were over 200 emaciated migrants, some unconscious, others dead from dehydration and suffocation. Many had been locked in for more than 2 weeks. It was a horror scene few could forget. Victor, however, was nowhere to be found. Having been tipped off, he'd vanished just hours before the raid, slipping away with forged documents and millions hidden across offshore accounts. For years, he remained a ghost, drifting between countries under fake identities, always staying one step ahead. But in 2018, his luck finally ran out. While attempting to launder money through an old associate in Bangkok, Victor unknowingly reached out to someone who had already turned informant. Within weeks, his location was pinpointed, a luxury villa in Phuket. A joint task force moved in swiftly and arrested him without resistance. He was extradited to Australia and in 2019 stood trial for human trafficking, manslaughter, and organized crime. The case was massive, one of the largest prosecutions of its kind in Australian history. The evidence was damning. Financial trails revealed laundering schemes stretching across continents. Intercepted communications exposed the coordination of smuggling routes. But perhaps most harrowing were the survivor testimonies. One young woman from Myanmar recounted through a translator how she had been lured with promises of work as a housekeeper in Australia. Instead, she was locked in a steel container with over 100 others. As oxygen ran low, she described hearing the sound of bodies collapsing around her, the pounding on steel walls, the unbearable stench of death. Nearly half of those in her container didn't survive. The courtroom fell into stunned silence, even hardened. Investigators were shaken. Victor remained stoic. No emotion, no remorse. He stared blankly ahead, occasionally glancing at the prosecution, his face unreadable. To some, that was the most chilling part, his cold detachment, the absence of any humanity. His trial lasted several months. Prosecutors dismantled his empire piece by piece, exposing a network so deep it reached into customs, shipping docks, and even corrupt officers. Dozens of his associates were arrested. Some faced their own trials. Others turned state's witness. Then came the first attempt on Victor's life. During a routine lockdown, guards found him bleeding from a deep stab wound delivered by a makeshift knife fashioned from scrap metal. He survived, but the message was clear. Even in prison, enemies surrounded him. Speculation swirled. Some believed the attack was orchestrated by rival smugglers angered by his downfall. Others suspected betrayal from within, former allies settling old scores. After that, Victor withdrew further. He was placed in solitary confinement for protection and spoke to no one. The man who had once ruled a vast trafficking empire was now a shadow of himself. As years passed, Victor became a relic, his name whispered as a warning in both criminal and law enforcement circles. His once powerful empire had collapsed. His allies had scattered or been jailed. His hidden fortune still unaccounted for. Some believed he left behind a final secret one. Last fortune stashed away, hidden beneath layers of forged identities and encrypted accounts. A myth, possibly, but those who truly knew Victor understood one thing. He never left loose ends, though the world moved on. The damage remained. The scars of Victor Langford's crimes ran deep. Survivors struggled to rebuild their lives, many with no legal status, trapped in limbo. Some remained in hiding, afraid of deportation. Others were sent back to hostile home countries where they faced violence, debt, or worse. A young Cambodian boy once enslaved for forced labor became the face of this forgotten aftermath. Tossed between housing programs and overwhelmed case workers, his life was consumed by red tape and broken promises. His trauma, like many others, went untreated. Some victims turned to the underground economy just to survive. Others vanished into Australia's undocumented population, living invisibly, forever haunted by what they had endured. And while Victor's arrest had been hailed as a major victory, authorities knew the war was far from over. Smuggling networks are hydras cut off one head, and others emerge. Whispers soon surfaced of new players stepping into the vacuum left behind. Investigators began tracing fresh financial trails, offshore banking schemes, and encrypted chatter looking for signs that Victor's old allies were rebuilding. His conviction, though historic, had only been the beginning of a much larger, far more complex fight. Because for every trafficker like Victor Langford who ends up behind bars, there are dozens more waiting in the shadows ready to profit off the desperation of the world's most vulnerable. Victor Langford's empire, death of a kingpin. Legacy of shadows even behind bars. Victor Langford refused to speak. Investigators questioned former enforcers, interrogated surviving associates, even confronted Victor himself, desperate to extract any final secrets. But Victor remained as he always had been, silent, defiant, and unreadable. Years in prison hadn't broken him. The failed assassination attempts hadn't made him flinch, and the certainty that he would never again see the outside world didn't compel him to cooperate. He never betrayed his network, never named names, never revealed where the rest of his wealth was hidden. His silence frustrated authorities and inflamed a darker suspicion. What if Victor Langford was still in control? Strings from the inside. One of the most persistent rumors surrounding the Langford case was that Victor had hidden a fortune before his arrest. Authorities had seized millions, but it was widely believed his true earnings far exceeded what was ever found. Offshore accounts, buried cash. Trusted associates. Victor was a man who planned decades ahead. Some claimed encrypted ledgers detailing his empire were destroyed in a police raid. Others believed he had left behind coded messages, breadcrumbs leading to his fortune. Treasure hunters, cybercriminals, even rival traffickers descended on Darwin and beyond. They scoured abandoned properties, combed through old warehouses, tracked suspicious cryptocurrency wallets, but nothing was ever recovered. Victor, when questioned, would only offer a cryptic, knowing smile. Inside prison, the once feared mastermind was a shadow of his former self. The years had taken their toll. He had built an empire from nothing, ruled through fear and absolute control. Now, stripped of power and plagued by paranoia, he rarely spoke. He spent most of his days in solitary, either by choice or for his protection. The attempt on his life had left him unstable. What little family he had refused to visit. His former allies had abandoned him at one point. Victor attempted to appeal his sentence, hiring a top-tier legal team to argue for early release on the grounds of good behavior. The court had none of it. The judge made it clear, no mercy for a man who had built his wealth on human suffering. And so, Victor Langford faded into obscurity. Guards stopped seeing him as a threat. New inmates didn't even recognize his name. His empire had crumbled. His riches, if they still existed, were lost. The power he once wielded was meaningless now, but the legacy he left behind, that was something else entirely. Survivors of his trafficking network still struggled to rebuild. Investigators still chased shadows, determined to dismantle every last remnant of the machine he'd created. In Victor's name, the smuggler, the mastermind, the ghost, still echoed in whispers, in cautionary tales, and in files stamped classified. Years after his conviction, one night a guard doing his rounds found Victor alone in his cell. He had refused food, refused medication. He hadn't spoken in days. His hands trembled. His once imposing presence was now frail, hollowed out by time and solitude. "Are you all right?" the guard asked. Victor turned slowly, eyes vacant, lips dry. And then, finally, he spoke. "They'll never find it," he whispered. "Find what?" the guard asked, startled. But Victor only smiled. By morning, he was dead. The official cause, natural, age, stress, and confinement, had finally caught up with him. But for those who had hunted his empire for years, his last words were a riddle, a cruel, final puzzle that would never be solved. If a fortune existed, it remained hidden. If secrets lived on, they died with him. And yet, his darkness persisted. The people he trafficked into Australia didn't find peace after his death. For them, freedom was a slow, uphill battle. Take S, a young Cambodian boy who had escaped forced labor. At 19, he was granted asylum and allowed to stay in Australia, but the trauma had carved deep. He was no longer shackled, no longer beaten, but he didn't belong. He wandered the streets of Darwin like a ghost in daylight, lacking family, education, and purpose. Many faced the same reality. Some were given temporary protection visas. Others were left in bureaucratic limbo, surviving on the edge of legality. A few found shelter in Australia's underground economy in documented labor, sex work, and other grey market trades. Without citizenship or work permits, desperation dictated their choices. Some feared deportation more than death, knowing that going home meant prison or worse, a return to the trafficking routes. The Australian government struggled to keep up. Social workers, legal advocates, and human rights groups fought for each case. But for every person helped, many more slipped through the cracks. Victor Langford was gone, but his network wasn't. Law enforcement knew smuggling rings like his didn't simply vanish. His empire had been vast, woven with hundreds of collaborators, many of whom had never been caught. Investigators across Australia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific pored over old records, followed money trails, decrypted old messages. One name kept surfacing: Raymond Gall. Raymond had been Victor's trusted lieutenant. He handled logistics, security, and controlled several smuggling routes. When the empire collapsed, Raymond vanished. Some said he fled to Thailand, using criminal contacts to disappear. Others believed he went deeper underground, rebranding the operation under a new name. In 2028, a breakthrough finally came. An informant, arrested in Malaysia, confessed to working for a mysterious figure known only as the Ghost. His methods mirrored Victor's: silent crossings by boat, fake visas, forced labor. Interpol and Australian Federal Police launched a joint operation. After months of surveillance, they uncovered the truth. Raymond Gall hadn't just survived, he had rebuilt. He'd learned from Victor's mistakes, choosing secrecy over scale. There were no palatial hideouts, no flashy luxury cars, just encrypted channels, modular cells, and ruthless efficiency. Victor Langford may have died in a prison cell, but the darkness he cultivated lived in whispers and scars, and in the shadows of men like Raymond Gall. And so the story continues. Victor Langford had become a ghost. His contacts were fewer, his movements more discreet, and his operations scattered across borders. By the time authorities traced him to a luxury safe house in Jakarta, it was too late. He had already vanished. All they found inside were encrypted drives, discarded burner phones, and a handwritten note in flawless English. you're always one step behind. As law enforcement chased Victor's shadow across continents, the criminal underworld was obsessed with something else entirely: his missing fortune. At the time of his arrest, over $200 million in assets had been seized: luxury real estate, offshore accounts, and vast cryptocurrency holdings. But experts estimated his total earnings exceeded $1 billion. So where was the rest? Theories spread like wildfire. Some believed he had moved his money into offshore havens under fake identities. Others claimed he buried gold and hard cash in the Australian outback, mirroring tactics used by drug cartels to avoid seizure. A few speculated that Victor had stashed his wealth in untraceable trusts, complete with coded instructions left behind for unknown heirs. Then, in 2030, the mystery exploded back into public consciousness. An investigative journalist named Elliot Harper published a best-selling Expose: The Last Secrets of Victor Langford. Harper had spent years interviewing Victor's former associates, retired detectives, and underground informants. But the most shocking revelation came from an anonymous source, someone claimed to have worked within Victor's inner circle. According to the source, Victor had hidden over $300 million in cryptocurrency spread across cold wallets and protected by unbreakable encryption. If true, it meant Victor's digital fortune was still out there, waiting. The book ignited a global frenzy. Hackers, cybercriminals, even cybersecurity firms began hunting for Victor's crypto treasure. Some combed the dark web for clues. Others pored over police records, looking for missed connections or encrypted leads. But like the man himself, the money stayed hidden, and so, the legend grew. Victor Langford was no longer just a trafficker or a smuggler. He was now a myth, a modern-day pirate whose treasure had never been found. Even after his death, fascination with his fortune only intensified. The trauma he left behind, however, was far more real. For his victims, the scars remained long after the headlines faded. Many survivors struggled to rebuild their lives in countries that had promised safety, but delivered only bureaucracy. Some disappeared into the underworld again, undocumented and unseen. Others fought for normalcy, haunted by memories they could never fully escape. One young Cambodian boy, once rescued from forced labor inside Victor's network, became a quiet symbol of survival. He learned English, worked odd jobs, and applied for permanent residency in Australia. But peace was elusive. The nightmares never stopped: the metal shipping containers, the sweltering heat, the screams, the silence that followed. He carried the weight of those who hadn't made it out, but he refused to let Victor Langford define him. With the help of a refugee advocacy group, he began telling his story. He spoke at human rights conferences, collaborated with journalists, and lobbied for reforms, real changes to immigration and refugee policies, so that no one else would fall into the same trap. And while he tried to heal, others continued chasing ghosts. In 2032, nearly a decade after Victor's empire had crumbled, a new twist emerged. An anonymous hacker leaked a trove of encrypted files, claiming they had once belonged to Victor himself. The documents included partial bank transfers, names of offshore shell corporations, and scattered fragments of digital wallet keys, pieces of a puzzle. It reignited global obsession. Some believed it was all fake, a trap to lure would-be treasure hunters. Others were convinced it was the key to unlocking the last of Victor's billions. Authorities investigated the leak, but the hacker vanished without a trace. The files were seized, examined, and ultimately, no answers were found. And so the mystery endured. Even with Victor long dead, his legend refused to fade. His name continued to cast a long shadow over law enforcement and the criminal world alike. The empire was gone, but the aftershocks remained rippling through cities like Darwin, where his smuggling routes had once thrived in silence. The authorities continued to dismantle the remnants of his network. Every time they closed a case, another would open. Every time they thought it was over, a new threat emerged. Victor had embedded himself so deeply that even in death, he remained part of the system's dark underbelly. But in the end, perhaps the most haunting question was also the simplest. Where was the rest of the money? Despite all their efforts, over $300 million remained missing. A sum so massive, it could change the life of anyone who found it. Theories swirled endlessly. Some believed Victor had transferred it to an errand secret, someone biding their time, until the world stopped watching. Others clung to a darker idea, that Victor Langford had never truly died, that the body cremated under his name belonged to someone else, that he had staged everything: his trial, his downfall, his death, and slipped away once more, leaving only false leads behind. Authorities dismissed the theory as fantasy. But that didn't stop online sleuths and obsessed treasure hunters from digging through his past, following every breadcrumb, because in the end, Victor Langford had become something more than a criminal. He had become a ghost story, a warning, a legacy that refused to fade. He hadn't been the only one caught in that trap. Many of the survivors, once silenced and invisible, had finally found their voices. They transformed their trauma into strength, stepping into roles as activists, counselors, and mentors for others who had walked through the same hell. Once pawns in Victor Langford's empire, they had seized back control of their own stories. They refused to be forgotten. By 2035, Victor Langford's name had vanished from the headlines. His criminal network had crumbled. His fortune, if it still existed, remained hidden, and the man himself was long dead. But his legacy endured, a permanent stain woven into the very history of Darwin. His crimes had cracked open the hidden world of human trafficking, forcing governments to respond, and his victims had become something more: symbols of survival and resilience. Living proof that even in the face of unspeakable horror, there was still a path forward. Yet shadows of his empire still lingered. Raymond Gay, Langford's second-in-command, remained a ghost, slipping undetected through the cracks of international law. Smuggling networks adapted to new technologies and legal loopholes, staying one step ahead of enforcement, and the search for Victor Langford's missing millions had become an obsession for treasure hunters, con artists, and rogue agents alike. Though his body had long since turned to dust, his story was far from over, because in the world of crime, no empire ever truly dies. It simply lies dormant, waiting for its next ruler to rise. Case 6. The Channel winds. The cold wind off the English Channel swept through the narrow streets of Calais, city that had long served as both a gateway and a dead end for those seeking a better life. For centuries, France's northern coast had been a critical point of passage, but by the late 1800s, it had gained notoriety for something darker. One of the most elaborate and deadly human smuggling operations in European history. The man behind it all was Charles Leclerc, a name once whispered in the alleys of Paris, Marseille, and beyond. Born in 1852 to a working-class family in Marseille, Charles was sharp, ambitious, and hungry for more. He grew up hearing stories of immigrants crossing the Atlantic in search of the American dream. By his 20s, he had carved out a career as a merchant in textiles and precious goods. But to him, legitimate trade was slowed too slow. He saw greater profit in desperation. By the 1880s, Leclerc had established an underground smuggling network that stretched from the docks of Bordeaux to the hidden inlets along the Seine. He partnered with corrupt port officials, rogue ship captains, and local enforcers. His scheme was cruel but effective. Offer desperate families a way to America, then exploit them for everything they had. People sold homes, livestock, and heirlooms to pay his exorbitant fees. But the journey they paid for was a lie. In Calais, victims were crammed into dilapidated warehouses disguised as boarding houses, prisons in all but name. There were no beds, little food, disease ran rampant, beatings were common. Some never made it past those walls. Leclerc's right-hand man was Henry Basita, disgraced former naval officer turned smuggler. He oversaw transport using modified fishing vessels rigged to conceal human cargo. These boats were unsafe, overcrowded, and barely seaworthy. Passengers were packed below deck with just enough air to survive. Instead of America, most found themselves dumped on the rocky British coast, confused, starving, and terrified. British authorities soon noticed the growing problem. Emaciated foreigners, unable to speak the language, began washing ashore in Dover and Folkestone. Some had been told they were already in America. Instead, they were fugitives hunted and alone in a foreign land, under growing diplomatic pressure. The French government cracked down. Raids swept through Calais. Warehouses were stormed. Low-level accomplices arrested. But Charles and Henry always stayed ahead, shifting operations further inland, changing shipping routes, bribing new officials. Still, the noose was tightening. In the winter of 1891, the operation began to unravel. A storm hit the channel just as a fishing boat named Le Sire left port, carrying nearly 100 people hidden in its hull. It was supposed to be a routine run, but the overloaded vessel couldn't withstand the storm. Waves slammed the deck. Water poured into the compartments. As the ship began to sink, the smugglers abandoned their human cargo and fled in the only lifeboat. The wreckage was discovered the next morning by local fishermen. Dozens of bodies, including children, washed ashore, a gruesome revelation of the horrors Laqueur had orchestrated. Public outrage exploded. Henry Bissett was the first to fall, trying to flee to Belgium. He was arrested at a train station in Lille. On him, authorities found coded documents revealing the full scope of the smuggling operation. That breakthrough triggered a wave of arrests across France. But Charles Laqueur was already on the run, using fake documents. He disappeared into the rural heart of Provence, moving from village to village, bribing his way through the countryside. For months, he evaded capture until early 1892, when an informant led authorities to a remote farmhouse. This time, there was no escape. Charles surrendered without a fight. His trial in Paris became a media spectacle, the biggest in decades. Each day, the courtroom overflowed with journalists, diplomats, and grieving families. Survivors testified, their stories painting a damning picture. A Polish mother had sold everything to send her 2 sons to America only to learn they had drowned in the wreck. An Italian boy described the days spent in darkness below deck, with no food, before being thrown onto an English beach. Through it all, Charles remained composed, wearing finely tailored suits, showing no remorse. The verdict was never in doubt. He was sentenced to life in prison and sent to the infamous Devil's Island penal colony. Henry and other key players received similar punishments. And though the smuggling empire they built was destroyed, its victims could never be made whole. Charles Laqueur's case became a turning point in France's war on human trafficking. It spurred international cooperation, stricter border policies, and deeper awareness of the brutal realities faced by migrants. But for the thousands he deceived, justice had come too late, and so his name faded into history, another dark chapter in Europe's past. But the lessons endured, how greed, desperation, and deception can combine to turn hope into horror. He had the bearing of a businessman, not a criminal. Charles L.C. sat in court expressionless, only speaking when directly addressed. When asked if he felt remorse for the lives lost, he merely shrugged. "I provided a service," he said coldly. "They wanted passage. I gave them what was possible." His lack of empathy enraged the public. Outside the courthouse, daily protests erupted. Families of the victims held up photographs of their loved ones and lit candlelight vigils. They demanded the harshest punishment imaginable. Charles's former Lieutenant Henri Bissett had turned state's witness in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony laid bare the entire operation: corrupt officials, hidden routes, and safe houses used to funnel migrants into perilous journeys. He portrayed himself as merely a subordinate, following orders in what he called Charles's army of deception. When the verdict came down, the courtroom fell silent. Charles L.C. was found guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, manslaughter, and human trafficking. The judge didn't hesitate. Life imprisonment at Devil's Island, the notorious penal colony off the coast of French Guiana. The sentence sent shockwaves through Europe. Devil's Island was infamous, a place where prisoners disappeared into the jungle and the relentless heat. Escape was thought impossible. The surrounding shark-infested waters saw to that. Charles showed no emotion. He simply nodded, accepting his fate with chilling composure. But those who had studied him knew better. Charles L.C. would not go quietly. In the days before his transfer, rumors swirled. Some believed he had stashed a fortune somewhere in France or in one of the far-off lands where his smuggling empire had stretched. Others whispered he still had allies working in the shadows, planning an escape. The journey across the Atlantic was grueling, heavily guarded. Charles never touched dry land until arriving at the gates of Devil's Island. Stripped of his fine clothes, thrown into a cramped cell, his old life vanished into memory. For most, the island was a slow death sentence: sun disease, malnutrition, and despair. But Charles was not like most men. He studied everything: the routines, the guards, their vices and weaknesses. He waited. Years passed. Outside, the world moved on. His name faded from headlines. But inside the prison, he was quietly manipulating. He traded favors, gathered information, turned gangs against one another, and earned protection. He didn't need brute force, he had influence. Like poison, he corroded the colony from within. Still, survival was never his goal. Escape was dot, and eventually, the opportunity arrived. A new group of inmates arrived. Among them, a young sailor named Etienne Rousseau, sentenced for smuggling. Etienne knew the surrounding waters better than anyone. Charles befriended him, convinced him escape was possible. It took months of planning: bribes, stolen tools, careful surveillance. Then one stormy night, they made their move. The guards took shelter from the wind and rain, and Charles and Etienne slipped through the cracks of the decaying prison. Their raft was barely seaworthy, tossed like driftwood in the raging sea. Etienne paddled with every ounce of his strength. Charles, weakened but unbroken, clung on, whispering directions and promises of riches. By sunrise, land appeared: the South American mainland. They had done the impossible. Etienne lay dead beside Charles, the escape too much for him. Charles, barely alive, crawled onto the shore. He was free, but freedom didn't mean safety. A fugitive, without a country, Charles had only one goal: rebuild his empire. Disappearing into the jungles, he wandered for weeks. Eventually, he found a coastal smuggling ring in Venezuela. They trafficked guns, drugs, artifacts, but most importantly, people. It was the trade Charles knew best. Though he arrived desperate and gaunt, it didn't take long before he became indispensable. He offered them strategies, connections, and bribes that actually worked. Behind the scenes, he dismantled the leadership, sowing division. Within a year, the gang's original boss was found dead, his throat slit with surgical precision. No one dared question who had done it. Charles had taken over. But Venezuela was just the beginning. Charles set his sights back on Europe. The human trafficking world had evolved, more sophisticated, more profitable, more dangerous. But Charles L.C. was born for shadows. With a rebuilt network and a new identity, he was ready to re-enter the empire he once ruled. The fall of Charles L.C. Reign of a ghost empire. Many of the so-called petty criminals in Charles L.C.'s circle were far from insignificant. They were intricately connected to a larger network: corrupt politicians, high-ranking officials, and multinational corporations that silently profited from human suffering. If Charles wanted to reclaim his throne, he knew brute force or visibility wouldn't suffice. He had to disappear But this time, it was not out of fear. It was strategic. For 2 years, there wasn't a single confirmed sighting. Some believed he had been killed. Others speculated he was living quietly in some remote corner of the world. But the truth was far more dangerous. Charles had spent those years constructing something new, an empire larger, more profitable, and more powerful than anything he'd ever ruled before. By the time whispers of his return reached European intelligence agencies, the transformation was complete. What had once been fragmented smuggling corridors now formed an interconnected web that spanned continents. Refugees escaping war-torn regions, young women lured with false job promises, entire families desperate for a better life. Fall became commodities in Charles's new enterprise. He didn't just traffic humans, he sold them to factories in need of cheap labor, to organized crime syndicates looking for fresh recruits, to underground markets where people were nothing more than disposable assets. And with every transaction, Charles grew richer. But wealth was never his end game. Power was. This time, he stayed invisible. No public appearances. No traceable communications. His empire was run through intermediaries, loyal lieutenants, who believed they were in charge, never realizing they were merely cogs in a machine controlled by a ghost. Charles orchestrated everything from the shadows. Every connection was indirect. Every trail went cold. But with power comes enemies. As his operation grew, so did the attention it attracted. Intelligence agencies across France, Germany, and the UK began noticing disturbing patterns. Thousands of missing persons cases, smuggling routes overlapping in unusual ways, organized trafficking cells appearing in cities that had never seen such crime before. Interpol launched a multi-nation investigation, and for the first time in years, Charles felt the heat. But he'd learned. Every lead vanished into thin air. His lieutenants had never met him in person. His financial trails evaporated into offshore havens. Witnesses disappeared, some intimidated, others silenced. To law enforcement, Charles became a myth, a phantom, but even phantoms bleed. In 1997, a warehouse raid in Marseille changed everything. Authorities discovered a shipping container bound for northern Europe. Inside were dozens of people, young, terrified, malnourished, and packed in like freight. But it wasn't just the horror of what they found, it was what the traffickers left behind. Amid the chaos, investigators uncovered a document with a single name, Charles LCA, careless signature on a financial record. It was the first concrete link to him in nearly 2 decades. France's highest law enforcement agencies launched a manhunt, the largest in recent history. Borders were sealed, known associates interrogated. Anonymous tips poured in, many false, but some disturbingly accurate. Charles knew the clock was ticking. His empire began to collapse. Trusted lieutenants turned on him, cutting deals for immunity. Corrupt officials who had once protected him now backed away, fearing exposure. He had spent a lifetime preparing to never be caught, but even the most untouchable men fall. In December 1998, police located him at a secluded estate near Lyon. When authorities arrived, they were met with a fortified compound, armed guards, and enough weaponry to hold off a battalion. The standoff lasted hours. Negotiators begged him to surrender, but Charles knew this time there would be no escape. A single gunshot echoed through the compound. When authorities breached the walls, they found Charles L.C. on the floor of his office, dead by his own hand, a pistol still gripped tightly. Surrounding him were piles of documents, files revealing the scale and structure of his criminal empire. Even in death, Charles had orchestrated his final act. No courtroom, no chains, just silence. But his death wasn't closure. It was revelation. Legacy of a ghost. The system that outlived its maker. The documents left behind at his estate uncovered a nightmare far worse than anyone had imagined. Charles hadn't just built an empire, He had architected a system, one designed to outlive him. In the months following his suicide, coordinated raids swept across Europe and South America. Dozens of high-ranking operatives were arrested. Their testimonies revealed a chilling truth. Government officials, business elites, law enforcement, all complicit, all profiting, and still the system kept moving. Even with Charles gone, shipments were intercepted. Victims continued to vanish. The very smugglers who had once answered only to him now operated under new leadership, faceless, nameless, and just as ruthless. The investigation, once focused on taking down a kingpin, had now morphed into a war against an invisible enemy. For law enforcement, it was a race against time. For the victims still trapped within, it was a daily fight for survival. Those who had known Charles personally began to see the grim design. He had planned for this. He had always known that names could be erased, but ideas evolve. True. Power doesn't reside in a face. It lives in an ideology. And his ideology was still alive, mutating, surviving, growing. By the time authorities mapped the true scale of his influence, it was too late. The machine he created had become autonomous, decentralized, smarter, stronger, and nearly impossible to kill. Charles L.C. became a cautionary tale, a myth, a specter. His empire had fallen, but the trade he perfected continued, and that was his greatest triumph. Operatives were no longer relics of the past. They were evolving, absorbed into new factions. Survivors of smuggling rings told the same stories, again and again. Whispers of a man who had seen it all coming. L never truly died. One survivor told a journalist, his system, it lives on, passed down to those who were always meant to take his place. The chilling part, evidence supported the claim. In raids conducted across Europe, authorities found entire new networks operating with the same precision, the same routes, even the same officials bribed. Just like before. Interpol and Europol launched joint crackdowns, targeting France, Spain, and Italy. Specialized task forces deployed, but every time they closed in on what they thought was a major figure, they uncovered nothing more than another disposable pawn. The true architects of this renewed empire, faceless, hidden behind encrypted networks, false identities, and layers of offshore banking. For every door kicked open, two more stayed shut. One of the most harrowing revelations came from a young woman named Elodie. She escaped a compound deep in the French countryside and gave a testimony that stunned investigators. She had been trafficked for 3 years, moved from one location to another, each more secure than the last. Her captors never mentioned a name, never spoke of Elle directly, but their behavior was uniform. They told me I would never be free, she said. That even if I escaped, there would always be another place, another system. Elodie's rescue reignited global efforts. With support from human rights organizations, more survivors came forward. Their stories painted a grim mosaic route stretching across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. This wasn't just an empire. It was an industry, and by the time investigators traced the new leadership, the truth was even darker than imagined. The criminals replacing Elle weren't underworld thugs. They were CEOs, politicians, investors. They had taken Elle's foundation and merged it with modern capitalism, real estate, shipping, even humanitarian aid. The very institutions once fighting trafficking were now unknowingly funding it. Public pressure soared. An unprecedented task force was formed, a coalition of intelligence operatives, financial regulators, and deep undercover agents. Their mission, uncover the masterminds behind this global enterprise. But as months turned into years, a disturbing reality emerged. For every arrest, another leader rose. For every syndicate dismantled, another adapted and survived. Human trafficking wasn't just an empire anymore. It had become a shadow economy, and while Charles L.C.'s capture and death had been declared a victory, those in the know understood the truth. The war was far from over, because as long as there were vulnerable people, as long as corruption and desperation thrived, the cycle would continue. L was a monster, yes, but he was never the monster. The real threat, the real horror, was the system that created him. Years after his death, journalists began connecting the dots, using testimonies, whistleblowers, and former insiders. They tried to map what was left of his empire. The results were as expected, as they were horrifying. The roots still active, the methods refined, the operations hidden under legal facades. The faces had changed, but the business had not. The new leaders, nameless, faceless, they didn't crave notoriety like El had. They wanted power in boardrooms, in politics, in places where exploitation could be masked as opportunity. They learned from his mistakes, and they became untouchable. Authorities fought on. Networks were dismantled. Victims were freed. But each breakthrough came with the bitter knowledge that it wasn't an ending. It was a brief pause, because L's empire had never truly fallen. It had simply changed hands. In the aftermath of his death, the world declared closure. News outlets hailed justice. Politicians stood before cameras and promised reform. But those closest to the fight knew better. L had never worked alone. His empire wasn't a one-man operation. It was a machine that had embedded itself into global commerce, banking, shipping, labor recruitment, even government supply chains. Its roots were tangled deep within legitimate businesses. Its foundation was cracked, but never destroyed. In the months that followed, law enforcement continued to strike. Raids uncovered hidden warehouses, offshore financial trails, and deeper layers of corruption. But with every step forward, the system evolved, almost as if it had been designed to survive its creator. New names appeared in reports, some old lieutenants of Elbe, others entirely new players who had waited in the shadows for their chance. The chaos following L's downfall had simply been a transition period. The empire hadn't died. It had adapted at first. The criminal world reeled. Trafficking routes were disrupted. Clients were left scrambling. But then, slowly, steadily new alliances formed. New routes opened, and the scars of L's reign faded into something more refined, smarter, harder to trace, even harder to stop. For law enforcement, it became a maddening cycle. Each win was a momentary disruption. Each arrest, a drop in a rising ocean. In a quiet office in Paris, an aging investigator flipped through a case file that never seemed to close. The photos changed. The names were new, but the stories were always the same. Victims promised a better life. Smugglers who spoke like salesmen, a chain of command with no top and no bottom. L was gone, but his empire wasn't, because it had never needed him to survive. It had only needed the world to look away.